practical applications of FLDs. All right, so in this lesson, I'm going to show you how you can create your own FLDs on TradingView, but chances are the process is quite similar with any charting software that you use. So just a quick recap, if you click on indicators panel here, you type in moving average simple, you click once on that, and it's going to bring up the moving average on the screen. Double click on the moving average itself, and you want to navigate to inputs in this panel here. And the important thing is the length and the offset. Now remember, like we saw in filters, an FLD is also a moving average, but instead of being displaced backwards, it is displaced forwards in time. So the first thing is the length. The length of an FLD is the same as the filter. Because remember, this is a filter that we're moving forward into the future. So in this case, I'm interested in looking at the 80-day cycle FLD. And for that, I need a 20-day moving average. It's 20 because it's 80 divided by 4. Remember, you always divide the cycle duration by 4. The displacement or the offset is where things change as compared to a filter. This is because in the case of an FLD, we want to project this moving average forward by 1.5 times the length. Again, we project the moving average forward by 1.5 times the length of the moving average. In this case, length of the moving average is 20. So we need to move this thing forward by 30 days, that is 20 times 1.5, in order to find this 80-day cycle FLD. Just to recap, in order to find an FLD of any cycle, you start with the cycle amplitude, 80 days in this case, you divide it by 4, that gives you a length 20, and then you multiply that length by 1.5 times to give you a displacement of 30. You can see here in the screen that unlike a filter, the FLD is moved forward in time. And I want to show you something. If I go to the present day here, you can see that the moving average is projected into the future. So it doesn't end where the price action is. There's always a future projection. So when I explained FLDs to you, I said, in theory, we can use these to project highs and lows in the price action. And we can also use these, the crossover of these FLDs, to determine the price at which a cycle will make a turning. I'll be perfectly honest with you, and this is the subject of the next video. Spoiler alert, the price projections don't really work so well. The time projections are a little better though. And so I want to zoom in here in 2022 on Bitcoin, and you can see that whenever the FLD was making a low, prices did make a high. It's not a perfect match, but it is close enough. At least it gives you a ballpark estimate of where you should be expecting a low. Again, it is not perfect, but it gives you somewhat of an estimate of when to expect a high or a low of any given cycle by looking at the FLD. There's another practical application of FLDs that I like quite a bit. Let's take this example here. When prices cross above the FLD and they cross back below, as took place here in August of 2022, that means that is likely going to be an 80-day cycle high. So this, and then you can see that the blue arrow, I have it drawn here because it highlights that was indeed an 80-day cycle high. And you can see that in every case where prices crossed above the FLD, back below, that turned out to be an 80-day cycle high. And that is pretty consistent. And in a similar manner, when prices cross below the FLD and then back above, what you're likely left with is an 80-day cycle. So this is something that I found very useful in FLDs, in spite of the fact that the price time projections can be a little iffy. Now they do work sometimes, as I'm showing you here in 2022. They give you at least a ballpark estimate of where you should expect that cycle turning point to take place, but it's not perfect. Whereas crossing above an FLD and back below pretty much always tells you that a high for that cycle has taken place, and crossing below an FLD and then back above pretty much always tells you that a cycle has made a low. Great example of that is here in March of 2023. You can see that there is a projection. The FLD is making a bit of a high. You could argue that it's making a high, and that does coincide with this low here. But more importantly, when prices crossed below the FLD and then back above, that told you that you had just seen that this area here, highlighted by the blue rectangle, was an 80-day cycle low. You zoom into the present, you can see that Bitcoin has just crossed above the FLD and prices are about to cross below it. If that happens, I will know that this area here is an 80-day cycle top. Now I'm waiting for that to happen. It hasn't happened yet, and I honestly don't know if it will, but notice that the FLD is telling me it's making a low around October 12th of 2023, and that tells me to expect a high around this time. So I would say that even though in theory FLDs should always tell you where the high and the low of a cycle is going to be, in practice they really don't. We highlight all these projections. You can see that all three of these projections roughly coincided with a low at some point. This one was a pretty good match actually. This one not so much. But when you're using these projections, which I'm going to highlight here, here, and here. So when you're using these projections in conjunction with the fact that prices should need to cross both sides of the FLD, then they begin to become a bit more useful. Let's say I want to highlight this projection for a low. So I draw this line, dashed vertical line. That is a moment in time when the FLD is making a high, and therefore should be seen as a forecast for a low. Now you can see that the forecast for prices to make a low was August 12th. The actual low came in a month later, September 11th. So just because you have a forecast for a high on an FLD, it does not mean that prices are absolutely going to make a high around that day. Sometimes it can be off by a month, sometimes it can be off by 2 months, and sometimes it can be off completely, as in the FLD is projecting a high, but there is no high, or it's projecting a low, but there is no low. However, if you're smart about this, what you can do is you can take this August 12th projection for a high and then look for confirmation. For confirmation, you can use ETLs or you can use the FLD itself. You can wait for prices to cross below the FLD, and then once prices have crossed back above, you can say, oh, well, that must mean that September 11 was an 80-day cycle low, because I have a forecast for a high here and prices have crossed below the FLD and then back above. Therefore, the last significant low must be an 80-day cycle low. And so even though the theory of an FLD can differ significantly from the practice of how FLDs work in reality, if you're smart about this, you can use that forecast for a turning point in conjunction with crossing the FLD to determine when a cycle turning point has taken place. As I just showed you in the case of, let's say, the second half of 2022, pretty much every projection that the FLD gave you for a high or a low in the 80-day cycle turned out to be a high or a low in the 80-day cycle. So it is always good to consult with your FLDs. It is always good to check to see what they're saying. Just be very careful. Don't fall under the impression that this is a panacea, that these projections will always turn out exactly as the FLD would suggest. I go back to May 2022, the FLD is making a high, so it's a projection for a low in the price section. And yeah, prices did kind of go sideways for a while, but there was no 80-day cycle here. You can see I don't have any blue arrows here. So yes, you could make the case that this FLD projection for a low led to a period of consolidation in the market. That's not very useful though. There's not much you can do with that. Even if I go back here, this is early 2022, you can see that it got messy. The FLD is projecting a low around this time and prices are making a low. And then it projected a low here, private high, so it's projecting a low, but prices were rallying. It got messy. So FLDs are not always useful. You need to look at them in the context of what prices are doing and how they relate to price. Specifically, if you want to follow my advice, using FLDs to make price projections, in other words, you're using them to project where in terms of price a cycle will make a turning point, I would say that that is not very useful. If you want to use FLDs to project when a cycle is going to make a high, low, that is more useful, but it doesn't always work. And you should always keep in mind that this rule that I just described for you, that prices should cross both sides of an FLD before determining that a cycle has made a turning point, is quite useful. Even that doesn't always happen, of course, but it keeps you honest. FLDs They're very useful. I always use them. I always want to know what they're projecting just because it's useful information. But I am not under the illusion that things will turn out exactly as the FLD is forecasting. That is usually not the case, actually. So that's going to do it for this section. This is how you calculate your own FLDs, and this is how you can use them in a real live setting.